Hi, good morning, everybody. Firstly, thank you very much to everybody who's organised today for inviting me along. It's lovely to be at Winston Palace, so thank you for that. I was given a lovely open brief today about what to talk about. So what I'm going to do is try to explain to you how I work and use some examples from some previous projects, and then go into some detail about the work I produced for Untold Lives here at Kensington Palace. There we go. So when I got the brief to talk about today, there was a kind of maybe talk about how you work and why you work, and it's the first time I've shown this slide at all, and it's the Museum of Modern Art in St. Barnard. And I grew up in Cambridgeshire, but I spent 4 years of my childhood in St. Barnard. And one afternoon, I don't know why, very unusual for my family, my parents took me along to this museum. I think I was probably about 11 or 12 years old. And I was completely obsessed by it. I don't think I'd ever been to a gallery or a museum, certainly not on this scale before. And I just had this instinctive desire to understand everything. I wanted to understand the works, the architecture. I just had so many questions: how the works got there, who decided what to show and why, and how the works related to each other. And these are all questions that still occupy me as an artist today. Hopefully you can see from the image that the paintings at the time were hung on clear sheeting on these concrete blocks. So you can see both the front and the back of the works. And in many ways, I'm continuing to try and look behind objects, work out the mechanics of how and why choices are being made in museums and galleries. I think for me, it also acts as an alternative way of querying, looking from different viewpoints, trying to challenge the status quo of what organizations do. Now, this isn't just, obviously it is a humble brag, but it's not just a humble brag. At the same time as I went to this museum, I was in school in Brazil, and I was learning about Brazilian history from a South American viewpoint. And I've got to say, Europeans didn't come out of it looking particularly brilliant. And there's this massive disconnect for me between my education in England and Europe and my education in Brazil. And it fundamentally changed me. It made me realize that what I was being taught in England was not the whole truth. And it led to a questioning attitude towards the status quo and authority, a questioning that I'd hope underpins my practice. So fast forward to the late 1990s, and I was working in museums at the Science Museum on this exhibition, Making the Modern World. In a completely appropriate piece of typecasting that I was delighted about, I was put in charge of collecting dolls and bears for the gallery. So dating from the 1750s to the present day, this gallery was trying to show a history of science and technology. And I was interested in trying to show contemporary diversity within those collections. And so in addition to collecting the curator hated me, this large collection of racially diverse Barbies, more than any museum would ever need, I also acquired Ken into the collections. So I also acquired his Latino boyfriend, Carlos, but sadly only Ken made it into the exhibition. I know, Carlos is in store. So this might be one of the few occasions that an object went straight from Prowler into a national exhibition. Maybe not. And actually what surprised me was how easy it was to do it. There was no pushback from the museum. And so I thought I'd carry on trying to push things along. So 10 years later, I'd retrained as an artist, as you do, as who needs pension. And I was commissioned by Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery to work for their collections. And we ended up producing Queer in the Museum, which ran from 2010 to 2011. I was particularly interested in working with Birmingham Museum as I'd been an undergraduate in the city. And I remember going around the museum. For any of you who don't know Birmingham Museum, it's vast. It's got collections ranging from decorative art, fine art to, oh, no, it's just got it all. And in the early 90s, when I was an undergraduate, there was one label in the museum that talked about homosexuality. And it was this one, for a painting by Simeon Solomon of Bacchus. And it talks about Solomon's sensuous but androgynous images can be linked with his own homosexuality, and his career later collapsed in 1873 when convicted of homosexual offences, and he spent the last 20 years of his life living mainly in a London workhouse. The 90s were grim because I thought this was really great. To have a label in a museum dealing with LGBT lives felt incredible. I mean, with hindsight, God, it was depressing time. But going back and working with the museum again, I wanted to kind of explore this label and why, in such a vast museum, this is what they chose to say, and kind of why it was so complicated to deal with LGBT lives in museums. Oh, fortunately, when I went back to the museum, I mentioned this label, and they opened a file cabinet, this one, because the museum's thrown nothing away, the label is still in Birmingham Museum. So going back into the museum, I thought let's look into the collections, see where LGBT lives are. So being a good museum person, I went into the database and looked up lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, and there were no objects came up on that search, which we all know, because of Simeon Solomon, is a lie, or at least an erasure of the truth. Kind of a bit frustratingly, I thought I'll put in queer, see if something comes up, and it did. It was this one object, which is a portrait of Dorothy Drew, who has an alarmingly, emphatically alive state, and has a queer kind of elfin charm. So out of all of Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery's collection, this is the one object that deals with queerness in a bit of a rubbish way. So I thought, if Birmingham aren't going to play fair, and I'm conscious of Linda's here, I'm not going to play fair either. I'm not going to do a queer exhibition in a temporary exhibition space. I'm going to take on the whole museum and queer it. And this was kind of 2010. So there'd been Hello Sailor at Merseyside, and there'd been the gay icons at the National Portrait Gallery. But museums really haven't done much about queerness. And I was terrified, but I didn't let them know that. And the first, dealing with the curator was great, and there were some objects that were kind of obvious to work with. And then the fine art curator asked me what I was going to do with Lucifer. And I said, well, that's really interesting. I mean, I've got my ideas, but what was your thinking? Obviously, having no idea what she's talking about. And she said, well, obviously, it's a sculpture with the head of a woman and the body of a man. So it's a trans sculpture in a way. I said, well, I mean, obviously, we're aligned in our thinking. And I was ashamed. I'd walked past this so many times and never realised this was going on. And actually, I think that's a huge part of museum collections, and the queerness is it's there, but we don't see it. So with this one, I made a cape of about 3,000 reincarnations, which were obviously the flowers that gay men in Victorian times would wear, signifying queer attraction, and draped it on the sculpture. And then this theme of the reincarnation went right throughout the exhibition, just signifying queerness there in the museum if you want to find it. And then they let me loose in the stores. So this is obviously a taxidermy otter and 3 salt lace and bears from different collections, which I know my audience, we all know this is about Airy Day Disco. And actually that's ridiculous, but that is what museum curators often do. They bring objects together to tell magic important to them, and they usually don't involve us. And so I kind of ended up in this place where I kind of work as a bit of a curator and a bit of an artist and a bit of an academic. And I slip between the three, and that's kind of comfy for me. And then I'm jumping on now to 2016-17, when I was up with an artist residency at the V&A. And I made a lot of work in response to their collections, but I don't really want to talk to you about that today. Not withholding, I just think some more other things to talk about. What I do want to talk to you about is that as part of the residency, there are some cases where, as an artist, you can move objects into them and display objects in a way that feels right. And so I decided to select objects from the museum's collections and arrange them in this case. And I chose to look at figurines in collections. And as a ceramics, I've had a kind of uneasy relationship with figurines. And they're beautiful, they're incredibly well made, but they kind of run counter to contemporary taste. I don't know if it's the diminutive size or the posing and the modelling of the figures, but to me they seem, I'm going to say it can. And in fact, what I was interested in exploring is why ceramic figurines echo the mannerisms of bachelor uncles from the 1970s. And I was interested in exploring what these figurines might reveal about historic portrayals of gender and how they might correspond to contemporary expectations of male and female behaviour. Can't believe they let me do this. So I started lining up a selection of the museum's figurines on a scale from the most butch figurine, not so many, to the most camp, quite a few. And this proved a little bit more difficult than I thought it would, and it led to discussions about what camp means and how to grade it. And realising that contemporary eyes will never completely understand how these seemingly effeminate performances of masculinity were read in the past, I decided to try and overlay a contemporary barometer of camp, the Eurovision Song Contest, onto the museum's collection to see whether there's any correlation between a country's contemporary success in Eurovision versus the campness of the museum's holdings of the figurines from the country. Now, I think that's a big surprise in the research. With most Eurovision wins out of any country, at the time 7, I was hoping for an avalanche of camp figurines from Ireland. Unfortunately, the holdings of Irish ceramics contain few figurines. However, where the research does come into its own is Germany, which has, I know you know, has entered the competition more times than any other nation, but it's only won twice. Scored highly on the number of figurines, but their scale was quite diminutive. Britain, 5 wins, came through on both number and size of camp figurines, and France, also 5 wins, seemed to concentrate on scale rather than number. So that's, I think that's categorical campus run through time. I was also lucky enough to do a couple of outreach projects at the V&A, one with Opening Doors, a group of older LGBT people. As part of the work we did together, they were given an LGBT tour of the museum, which was great. What came out in the feedback, though, was the group were saddened that LGBT interpretation was an add-on. They felt it wasn't core to the labelling. It was a tool, it was a pamphlet, it was somewhere on the website. And I kind of wanted to dig into that and see whether it was true. So I spent all my lunch hours for 6 months going around V&A looking for LGBT labels. And as you know, the V&A is quite large, so it was great. They had 2 labels dealing with LGBT lives. They had one for the Tom Finland stance and one for this Grand Fury Kissing Doesn't Kill poster. So the V&A links LGBT lives to sexually transmitted disease and soft porn. And that's sad. I didn't keep this to myself. I brought it up with the museum in a very calm, collective, joint way that this maybe could do with being pluralised. And since then, it has been to some extent. There was some kickback from a member of staff saying, well, the museum doesn't talk about heterosexuality, why should we talk about queer lives? It's called the Victoria and Albert Museum. And when we managed to label these two outfits designed by Lee Bowery for a Michael Clark ballet made by Mr. Pearl, without mentioning queerness, that silence is very, very loud. And when you put them in a heterosexual pairing, I mean, if I could raise an eyebrow, I would be doing that now. And I think it's important to come back to museums and just talk about, hold that mirror up. This is what you're doing. I know there's lots of lovely liberal people working in your museum. I know you want LGBT people to feel welcome and inclusive, but guys, you've got to do the work. So moving on, a couple of years later, I was contacted by the Fitzwilliam. This bit isn't very queer, so I'm sorry, but it's nice, but it's not very queer. I was contacted by the Fitzwilliam Museum, who had acquired a collection of about 300 Clarion portrait busts, and they kind of weren't sure how to explain what to do with them, and they asked me would I work with them on it, and I was like, yeah, great. The busts are fairly similar. They're nearly all white. They're nearly all the same size, and they're nearly all of they're Victorian men with great facial hair. And I thought there was something to be done with them. And what I was interested in were these busts were made in kind of the 1850s to the 1900s, at the time when the British Empire was at its peak. And I was interested in trying to see if there was a relationship between what Britain had done overseas and how Britain was presenting itself to itself. And obviously these sculptures were made for domestic consumption, but when they come into a museum, they become part of the national dialogue about how the country represents itself. And going through the bust, I think fortunate is the wrong word, there were a number of people represented in the collection who were responsible for colonial genocide overseas. And hats off to Fitzwilliam. When we had a meeting, said, I think I want to talk about colonial genocide with these collections. And I'm like, yeah, okay, we can do that. The braveness of those curators to go with this. The main part of the exhibition was in an octagonal room. So I had an entryway and an exitway and 6 other walls. And on each of those walls, I created 12 wallpapers, each of them representing a British colonial project overseas. This is obviously discussing the Opium Wars. And this one in the background is looking at the famine in Ireland. On each of the 6 walls, individuals in the Clarion collection were placed on the wall against one of the atrocities they were either implicated in or responsible for. So here with the Irish famine, we have Robert Peel, who was the PM during the famine, and William Gladstone, who expressed concern repeatedly over the cost of the Irish relief to Ireland during the famine. And I was particularly keen to deal with the Irish famine in this project. This colonial project it's complicated and it needs unpacking very carefully. Yeah, we're going to leave that there. So back to the central space. The former director of the British Museum, Neil McGregor, talked about his experiences working in Germany, where he felt there was a determination to find the historical truth and acknowledge it, however painful it may be, which he thought stood in contrast to the endorsed historical narratives often found in Britain. He talks about the German word Mahnmal, defined as a monument to national shame, or as a warning of events that should not be allowed to happen again. And they perform a very different social function to celebratory public sculptures. And for me, I think this installation of the octagonal room at Fitzwilliam could be read as a Mahnmal, not seeking to talk about whether these were good or bad people, but to try and include a more balanced and nuanced view of their lives and the different views of them, that they were held by people being colonized or people doing colonization. And I was interested in what change this influx of the Glen collection to the museum would have on the existing collections, and how the established history of the museum might be altered and reviewed in the light of these new additions. So I set up a number of conversations between pieces from the Glen collection with objects in the galleries. So in ancient Greek, Ariadne provided the thread which allowed Theseus to find his way out of the Minotaur's labyrinth. And within the exhibition, she provided that thread, which literally links the newly acquired Parian ware to the existing sculptures, in this case, a French bronze. And another Greek, Narcissus, sees himself reflected in the mirrored pools and allows us to see whether we see ourselves both physically or metaphorically reflected within the museum. And I hope he also lets us consider who is currently not able to see themselves reflected in the museum. And the Parian ware sometimes spoke very loudly without my help. So here, the young emigrant in the middle is surrounded by the four seasons, who all relate from him on his journey. And in other kinds of love, new Parian ware, piece found itself in the middle, is placed between two adjacent bronze figure groups by the Italian sculptor Massimo Venzi. On the left is Leda and the Swan, and on the right, Ganymede and the Eagle. I hope the installation explored how a layer of patina in the long-standing tradition of classical mythology and the authority of the museum sector moved two subjects, having sex with a swan and having sex with an eagle, from unacceptable to acceptable. And obliquely ask, if swan sex is okay, why has it taken museums so long to include the LGBTQ people within their interpretation? So, in 2020, final case study before I go on to Kennington Palace, I worked with Pitt Rivers Museum exploring links between contemporary international homophobia and the museum and its collection. Drawing on these photographs by Henry Evans, these disturbing and supposedly scientific recordings of difference, which map what was visible, but to our current eyes, I think removes the humanity from the subject. I went on to select images from the museum's archive from countries where the British had imposed homophobic legislation. By adopting the geometric backgrounds from Evans' photographs, erase the humanity from the images until all that remains is what they wore and what they owned. In some ways, mirroring how museums tend to prioritize material culture over emotion or effect. And these went on to become a series of 7 screen prints, which also became textile banners. Unintentionally, 4 of the 7 photographs have been taken by the same photographer, Wilfrid Thesiger, whose writing about men contains references to his own queer desires. Within our museums, we often rely solely on written evidence to validate knowledge, and with histories of homophobia, queer knowledge was seldom recorded or preserved. And I think that I went through around 20,000 images, selected 7, and 4 of those were by a queer photographer. I think lends some weight to Robert Mill's assertion that our encounters with archives are saturated with desire. So, on to today. Last year, I was approached by our predecessors, the lovely team at Historic Royal Palaces, when they were developing the Untold Lives exhibition. And they came to me and said they wanted an LGBTQ presence in the exhibition. With the help of Matthew's story, a number of possible narratives were identified. The shortlist came down to a lesbian lute player and a court usher who was found fumbling in the bushes with another man. I mentioned the court usher, Gustavus Dickens. We're going to see the work later. Sorry for people in the room are going to see the work later in the exhibition. So I wasn't going to go through the narrative of the plays. But for the people at home, his story is long and complicated. And I thought actually a comic strip in 12 meat platters might be the way of trying to unpick this. Yeah, make your own jokes. So Gustavus was a married father of 2 from a wealthy background who became a court usher. And he was allegedly found in the supplicant, legal terms, not mine, position with a young legal clerk in Hyde Park. And the story gets complicated when Gustavus manages to escape being tried, but ends up in Fleet Prison where he eventually dies. In a brilliant twist, the man who accused him of having sex in the park, a Mr. Cannon, later propositioned another man in St. James's Park and was tried and found guilty of extortion. Cannon was sentenced to death and ended up being deported to Australia. He was a bad gay. Because Gustav came from money and married and had children, there are records of the houses the family owned, where he married, where his children were christened. And after working with queer histories, it was just a relief to have so many records related to this man. And so many of the buildings that he lived in or frequented are still accessible to them. He felt very alive and very present when I visited those buildings. So, it's a juicy story, appropriate to place on meat platters. And I just thought I'd go through the making. I don't usually do this, but I thought we're going to see the plays. And I kind of banged on to musings that actually the objects aren't there and you want to tell clear narratives. I'm an artist, I'll make them for you. And they pulled my bluff and I did. So this is how you make a queer meat platter set. In case anybody wants to recreate this at home. So this is an original Georgian plate on the left, which I've put into clay and created a plaster mold. And here are the molds drying in the studio. And in 1788, when Gustavus worked for the palace, King George III visited Blight's Worcester factory, now Royal Worcester, and ordered a breakfast service in the blue lily pattern, which was subsequently renamed Royal Lily in honour of Queen Charlotte. This is the same date as Wesley was working in the palace. And so the lily pattern provided the colourway of white and blue with red and gold highlights that was going to come through in the eventual plates. And for each of the 12 plates, I started pulling together contemporary images which could form the basis of the narrative. And I should say, I could have done this all digitally, I could have done transfers, but it felt really important to use the technology that was available when Gustavus was working at the palace, so they're all hand-painted. And these images were mapped into layouts before the transferring them into pencil on the fired ceramic plates. Each plate was then hand-painted in cobalt carbonate, which turns from grey to blue in the firing, and the plates were then glazed. And the gold and red lustres were added for the final firing, before coming together to tell the whole story, or partially, of Gustavus's life. Because we're filthy, one plate attracted more attention than others. Hogarth's tailor, and hidden behind a shrub, needs the earnest red. And in many ways, this is core to the story. We don't know for sure what happened in Hyde Park. Gustavus was never tried, and Cannon was proved to be an extortioner. But the association with scandal and shame was enough to get Gustavus sent to flee prison. The more I dug, the more it seemed like this narrative was more about shame than sex, and particularly about queer shame. I wanted to place the works in a contemporary setting, and so began sourcing quotes about gay shame to pair with the platters. These range from quotes from celebrities to interviews, really generously done with current Royal Historical Palaces staff. I purposely didn't want the place to be merely a historical record, but a marker for the effects of science and shame that still impact today, to implicate all of us and visitors to the palace in the ongoing tussle between pride and shame. Thank you.
Yeah.